Hello everyone and welcome to the recap show of the Saint Louis Rapid Blitz. My name is Tatev Abrahamyan and I'm going to take you through day 2 of Rapid. So we started the day with 2 leaders, Levon Aronian and Pantala Harikrishnan. At the end of the day, we're left with 1 leader, the world champion Magnus Carlsen. The world champion had a disappointing day 1 where he actually got disconnected and he lost, and then he drew his 3rd game against Wesley So. But today he won all his games and now he's in sole lead. So let's dive into the games and see what happened in day 2. Okay, so let's start with our key matchup of round 4. So we already had a great round. We had Levon Aronian with the black pieces facing the world champion. So these games have always been great, as Levon Aronian was a long time number 2 and a big rival of the world champion. But something went horribly wrong for him right from the beginning. He played the Grunfeld and he got this terrible position where after d5, knight d7. So it's not good to take because of knight c5 and d3 will hang. The world champion glides the bishop back. And white just has an amazing position with this great center and this destroyed pawn structure next to the king, and just everything is in his favor. So he won the game quite easily, so I will take you through the rest of the game. So he just wins a pawn. Doesn't trade queens because the black king is bad, so we don't trade queens when our opponent has a poor king. Centralizing the knight, centralizing the rooks, going after other weaknesses, distracting the queen, and now this pawn will also fall. And now the knight is not going to survive for very long. There are no more checks, there's no funny business with rook g1, so queen b2 is played, but forcing a queen trade up a piece, Aronian decides to resign. So our other leader, Pantala Harikrishnan, also lost his game. He lost to Jan Nepomniachtchi. So let's take a look at that game. Let's jump straight into game move 25. So this was quite a complex position, and in this position Nepomniachtchi went knight d3, and he got this passed pawn, and actually this passed pawn ended up winning the game for him. So after this trade that happened, this pawn is becoming a real problem for white. So attacking the knight, doubling, protecting the pawn, and now this is just a very healthy passed pawn, and we have a bishop versus a knight, and of course a knight in this kind of position is not going to fare well against the bishop because the position is very open and we have pawns on both sides of the board. So let's see how the game ended. Very good move. Going to harass the rook away from d2 and just keep pushing the pawn. And now the pawn is all the way on d2, and the passed pawn that's on the second rank is already a very strong passed pawn and a very difficult one to deal with, especially since it's defended by the bishop, so it's just going to be untouchable. Threatening to go rook c1. Now we have a threat of queen a1. So he decides to give the piece, but the game ends in just a couple more moves. So important win for Jan Nepomniachtchi, who actually leapfrogged Harikrishnan because he was a point behind. So with this win he got 2 points. So let's take a look at this game between Jeffrey Zhang and Alexander Grischuk, which is a heartbreaking loss for the young American player who was defending for a long time in this rook versus 2 minor pieces on a pawn position, but this last move of king f3, walking into a fork, is really unfortunate, just losing the game. So the game between Hikaru Nakamura and Alireza Firouzja was quite wild. The opening was quite strange and led to a very interesting pawn structure. If we look at it, there are so many pawn weaknesses and so many pawn islands. So the mistake came in this position that after knight e2, defending the pawn and transferring the knight to f4, the young Grandmaster played knight c7, allowing for knight g3, attacking the defender, and now it's impossible to take, and we're going to win some material. So he decides to slide back with the bishop, king d7, and now even though Hikaru gave up his bishop for the knight, he is going to pick up a couple of pawns. So these pawns are very weak, and if we look at this knight is actually an amazing piece because it protects two major targets. And now these pawns are just falling one by one. So we're going to see an interesting endgame, which I think it's a good one to look at because we looked at rook versus pawn yesterday, so today we have a different version. So this pawn is running, but unfortunately it's not going to go too far. I really like this b4 move, chasing the king away, taking on d5, and rook d4. And now the problem for this king is it cannot get too close. So the king goes around, and Hikaru is okay with giving up his rook because he has an avalanche of pawns. So he takes, and h7 is a threat, and this kind of pawns are unstoppable. Once two pawns, for example, if you go back, once two pawns reach the 6th rank, a rook cannot handle them because they're just going to queen. For example here, okay, we're not going to blunder, but after something like this, h7 and the pawns will queen. So this was actually a very bloody round with 5 decisive games. So let's take a look at our final decisive game between the two Americans, Wesley So and Dominguez. So let's jump to move 27. This game was also pretty wild. If we take a look at what's going on, Wesley is attacking, and Lanier, after queen g3, Lanier pushes his pawn. So a very dynamic position. And actually the way Lanier lost is a bit counterintuitive. We saw another example of this yesterday when he throws in a check, and you know, when you throw in a check, usually it's to win time, like 5 seconds on the clock, and actually it misplaces the bishop. He should have played king g7, defending this pawn, but after bishop c5, I will show you the difference. King g7, there's a very annoying move e6, and with threatening queen e5 and the bishop. So now actually the bishop is very poorly placed. And something like this, this king is just not going to survive very long here. Something like this, we're already getting mated. So just one move makes such a big difference in the position, and this move actually looks harmless. It just looks like you're winning we're winning time on the clock. So this happened, so I think he realized that something has gone wrong, so we went for this endgame. Now the king has to go to g8. So now pushing the pawn is impossible. Picking up the rook and stopping the pawn. Instead, king h7 was played. But with checks, with this nice geometry, he picks up the rook again, and it's just too much material. So let's move on to our next round. So let's move on to round 5. So round 5 was a lot quieter. It only had 2 decisive results. So I mentioned that Magnus Carlsen won all his games, so it's not hard to guess which one was one of the decisive games. And the second decisive game was actually by Jeffrey Zhang, the young American Grandmaster, who played a phenomenal game, played a miniature to defeat, with the black pieces, Jan Nepomniachtchi. So actually we can take a look at the whole game because it's quite short. So with the black pieces, Jeffrey plays the Alekhine defense. He said in the commentary that he was just looking for a game, but what he got was much better. So let's just go through the opening to our key moment. And here this pawn grab is quite greedy, and the problem is this king and this development. And now tactically this is just not working out. Should be 5, and now check. And the problem is so king f1 gets mated, and this would run into something like knight d4, and this rook is ours. We don't even have to take it right now, and the rook is ours, and I want to say so is this king, because this king actually doesn't really have any good places to go to, and looks like it may not survive for too long. We'll capture this back, we'll just at the very least can pick up a rook. So instead he goes bishop b5. Jeffrey decides to give up his knight. So repeats once. He considered bishop c4, he didn't see anything conclusive, but I really like the move he plays here, rook b6, which really limits the queen. So the queen cannot reach the king in any kind of position to protect him. And simply takes back. And it's actually kind of a funny looking position because if the king hasn't moved, we could have castled. And okay, it would be some kind of a position. And if someone gave you this position, you probably wouldn't think that the king had moved, right? Because it's its initial plays. But because the king has moved, this is just a struggle for white. There's not much to do. Goes queen d5 and takes, and the position is quite miserable. There's too many threads. This is a thread, this is a thread, this is a thread. And Yanni Pomniachtchi just decided to resign this game and just end the suffering here because there's just not much to do. And now let's take a look at the game between Lanier, Dominguez and Magnus Carlsen, because that was quite remarkable. The world champion spotted such a beautiful tactic that really broke the harmony in his opponent's position. So let's go to the key position of the game. So in this position, Lanier Dominguez plays queen e4, which looks like a normal move. And then immediately the engine bar goes down, which means that black is winning. And it's kind of mysterious because, why should black be winning here? It's because he has this beautiful shot of rook b2. And rook b2 is impossible because e4 is hanging. So the king has to take, and now d3, and now we see the power of this bishop. So the king goes back. And the geometry here is just really beautiful. He tries to run away, and then the bishop comes into play again. So Lanier decides to resign here in view of take. And here actually we have to be careful as black because bishop e1 runs into trouble. There's this move f6, and now black is the one who has to make a draw because this gets mated. So black has to go back, and white can give a perpetual. But of course black doesn't have to do this. Black simply can take. I think this is the easiest one, and just go for this winning endgame with 2 extra pawns. So after bishop h4, Lanier resigned the game. So this was 2 in a row for the world champion. And next game he is playing with the white pieces. He is playing against Mentala Harikrishna. So during the post-game interview, after the 3 rounds, he said the rounds 1 and 3 were a gift. And round 1, I think he said that because he just got such a great position after 10 moves, completely dominating. And in this position, in this game, his opponent simply blundered in 1 move, which is always such a painful way to lose a game. When you're playing well, you're playing fine, and then 1 move just costs you the game. So if in this position, Harikrishna goes knight c5, which is attacking the 2 bishops. So it looks like maybe we're forcing a trade to go into opposite color bishop position, but unfortunately there's rook f1, and the problem is the queen cannot go anywhere to defend the knight because of back rank issues. So now black has the decision of either giving up a knight or giving up a queen for the 2 minors, for a rook and a minor. So he decides to do that, but unfortunately the position does not offer enough counterplay. And cannot take back because of another pin. Like, so many nice tactics we see by the world champion, just amazing. And Harikrishna decides to just resign. Also, you don't have a move. We don't really have a good move with the king, and something like h4 is going to be in the air, trapping this knight at some point. So another smooth win by the world champion, who is now leading the tournament. So let's take a look at our other decisive games, the one between Hikaru Nakamura and Yanni Pomniachtchi. And this game was completely wild. I cannot really do it justice in this kind of video because it was just so complicated. Hikaru gave up 3 pawns. He didn't get much for it because his follow-up was a little inaccurate. Then it was up and down. There was queen versus 2 rook position. So there's just a lot that happened in this game that will take probably hours to really analyze thoroughly. So let me just show you what happened, because we reached the position on move 51, and the engine here was already saying that this position is close to a draw, because there is a move queen e7 going after this pawn, and it's actually very uncomfortable to defend this pawn, because now the queen is going to start checking, and there's never any kind of blocking of checks because the rook is hanging. Instead, Hikaru took the pawn on f5, and actually it's kind of funny because by taking his pawn it looks like he's getting close to equalizing the material, but actually he's making his king weaker, because the f5 pawn was preventing any kind of two rook checkmates. So rook g3. Now the king is cut off, so there's all kinds of mating nets coming up. Now putting the king in a box, and now this check is coming. So check, and now we're getting checkmated. So this didn't happen after rook f5 he resigned, but I thought it was very instructive how taking the wrong pawn actually hurts your position, because the white king was hiding behind that pawn. Like, the white king could actually stay on the f-file when the pawn was there, because there was no checks on the f-file. And our final decisive game, it's also a bit of a heartbreaker. It's a game between Dominguez and Alireza Firouzja. So Alireza actually ran out of time, because we had this final position that had a result, and we had this yesterday when we were looking and wondering, why is there a result, what's going on? There is no way someone resigns in a wild position, this doesn't happen. And turns out he ran out of time, which is really unfortunate. This was also a wild game, he was doing really well, so he already gave up his advantage, but something like queen c6, something like this would be a repetition. So maybe he was looking for something more, he was looking for a win in a position, didn't realize he's low on time and ran out of time. Again, like blundering in one move, disconnection, like flagging like this, all of them are very disappointing way of losing the game. But this is also flagging is something that can happen over the board too, so it's not just something that happens online. So it was a tough day for the young player, he lost 2 games. But tomorrow is another day. Tomorrow is actually going to be the final day of the Rapid. And in the Rapid, each win is worth 2 points, and a draw is 1 point and a loss is 0, which is twice as much than it is in Blitz. So if Magnus Carlsen kind of runs away with it, it's going to make it difficult for anyone to catch up to him. So tomorrow I think is a big round, because the players who are chasing him will need to, if they cannot catch up to him, maybe keep the gap at 1 point, which is where it is right now. So I think there's a lot of pressure on his opponents to try to keep up with Magnus, and if he has another day where he wins 3 out of 3, then that might be very difficult to do. So make sure you're tuning in tomorrow to Saint Louis Chess Club YouTube channel or to uschessgems.com, 1 p.m. Central. See you there, and thank you for checking out this video.